Good morning. I'd like to welcome you back to another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. Also, I'm looking forward to digging into an important topic this week. And if you joined us this past Sunday, you'll know where we're going. In our study this week, we are in Luke chapter 9, verses 46 through 56 together. And the topic we're going to address is the miracle of Christ's church. We're going to look at how the fact that there is a Christian church that is all around the world and the gospel is spreading from generation to generation. We're going to examine how that really is an absolute miracle. And so let's pick up Luke chapter 9, verse 46. Here's what it says. Then there arose a reasoning amongst them, which of them should be the greatest. Jesus, perceiving the thoughts of their hearts, took a child and set him by him, and said unto them, Whomsoever shall receive this child in my name receiveth me. Whosoever shall receive me receiveth him that sent me. For he that is least among you all, the same shall be great. John answering said, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him, because he followeth not with us. Jesus said unto him, Forbid him not, for he that is not against us is for us. It came to pass, when the time was come, that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent messengers before his face, and they went, entered into a village of the Samaritans, to make ready for him. And they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? But he turned and rebuked them, and said, Ye know not what manner of spirit ye are of. For the Son of Man is come not to destroy lives, but to save them. And they went up to another village. The passage in front of us is fascinating, and we're kind of looking at the continuation of what we dealt with last week, and that is dealing with this issue of ministry pride. Pride in ministry, selfish ambition, is something that is a great problem. It's a tremendous temptation for people in ministry. And what I'd like us to do is I'd like us to continue in that topic, but I'd like us to think of it in light of the rest of the story of the advance of the gospel through these individuals, the apostles. When we go to Matthew, it says that Christ is going to build his church and that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That is what Jesus said when Peter said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. We need to be reminded as we look at this text that the church of God is not built by men, but it is built by God through men. And ultimately, when we see how God builds his church through men, and we think about the nature of those men that he uses, what it reminds us is the fact that the building of the church of God and the sustaining of the church of God is ultimately this tremendous miracle that God is performing from generation to generation, how he builds it and how he sustains it and how he preserves it and protects it. And so with that in mind, I want to go back to a little bit of the content of last week, but we're going to drift into this text, recognizing how this text is clearly connected back to what we talked about last week. And so there are actually four manifestations of this pride in the disciples, and we find it all throughout the book of Luke. Luke chapter 9, we see it several times. I like to highlight them. The first of those, we could say, expressions of this root of selfish ambition is a self-reliance. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. In verses 40 and 41, it says, I besought thy disciples to cast him out, a demon. They could not. Jesus answering said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I suffer with you? Now, what is Jesus telling the disciples? Well, he's telling them that he's amazed at the fact that they're unable to do this, and he's emphasizing the fact that they are faithless and that they are a perverse generation. Faithless meaning that their faith is misplaced, it's misguided. And the way that they're looking at this concept of ministry is twisted. That's what he means by a twisted, perverse generation, or a faithless generation, one whose confidence is in the wrong place. In other words, there was, rather than a Christ reliance, there was a self-reliance, which ultimately roots back to what? To pride. The second expression is found in verses 46 to 48. It says, Then there arose a reasoning amongst them, which of them should be the greatest. Now, what's going on? Well, Jesus is talking about the fact in this passage that these disciples have this rivalry amongst themselves about who should be preeminent, who should be the one who has the strongest position, those kinds of things. And so what does Jesus do? Well, he takes a child, he pulls him aside, and he says, if I send this child and someone receives him in my name, they've received me. What's he saying? Well, what he's basically saying is I can work through anybody I choose to. Here's a child. You don't think of him as being impressive. He's not strong. He's not wise. He's just a dependent child. But I'm choosing to work through him. And in the same way that I could work through a child, I work through you. And so what's he doing? He's challenging them to humble themselves and recognize that they should just be grateful that God's working through them. A third expression of this selfish ambition is what we find in verses 49 and 50, where John answers and he says, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name. We forbade him because he followeth not with us. And Jesus said, forbid him not. He that is not against us is for us. And so we see the expression in the self-reliance. We see the expression in this interpersonal rivalry. And we see this expression in the desire to control and to say, you have to be with us. You have to follow us. We have to kind of verify your ministry, where the disciples are not the ones who are ultimately in charge. It's Christ. In other words, this person who is doing ministry is not under the disciples. He's appeared to the disciples. And so Jesus is the one who's ultimately in charge. And we see it expressed in that way. And then the fourth example, which is the one that we're kind of introducing this week, is found in verses 53 to 56. It says, they did not receive him because his face was as though it would go to Jerusalem. And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? He turned and rebuked them and said, you know not of what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man came not to destroy men's life, but to save them. And so this fourth example of pride revealing itself in ministry is that when things get disappointing, these people take it very personally. And we could even say that the reason that they were so quick to snap at this group of people wasn't just that they were disappointed and took it personally, that they were not necessarily accepting Christ and the disciples, but there was also the Samaritan aspect to it. And so the disciples had this built-in prejudice. And so because of this bias toward the Samaritans, they're very quick to rush to condemn them. Well, what is the point of all this? Well, the point is that pride is a continual source of temptation in ministry. And pride does not always manifest itself in the same way. Sometimes it's a self-reliance. A person appears to be very strong, but the reality is there's a pride where they're depending on self, or people become contentious and they're rivals with one another. And we could say, well, the person's just ambitious, but that ambition is technically pride. Or a person wants to be in control of everything instead of recognizing that they're peers to other Christians, peers to other ministers of the gospel. They see themselves as in charge and everyone needs to come under their authority rather than recognizing we are peers under the authority of Christ. Or in the last, we take ministry disappointment personally. We allow maybe our bias against a person to kind of cloud our judgment so that we become much harsher toward them. You say, well, Joel, what is the takeaway? Here's the takeaway. Pride is tricky. It can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. It can appear to almost be a righteous indignation, but that righteous indignation actually is not a righteous indignation. It's a form of pride. We have to be on the alert. We have to be on guard at all times. We can't get to the place where we think, wow, I've been walking with the Lord for all these years, so I'm past this pride thing. It doesn't work that way. So long as we're in this body of flesh, we're going to deal with temptations of various kinds. And if we are in a position of ministry, which we should be in positions of ministry as God's people, we need to recognize that pride is often at the door and can quickly take its foothold and can become extremely destructive. My encouragement to you this morning is let's be a people who are cautious and guarded about this issue of pride. I'm looking forward to, Lord willing, tomorrow, continuing to dig into this passage of Scripture as we see how Christ works with the disciples, even though they are clearly very flawed instruments. And I think there's a great encouragement for us as we will continue into this passage. Have a blessed day. If this has been an encouragement to you, I hope that you'll share that and perhaps share it with someone else who can be challenged by it. We'll, Lord willing, be able to talk more about this tomorrow. Bye now.